being from a matrilineal family, my roots are Nanaimo, Snuneymuxw, and Stalo territory from the Squaw Reserve in Chilliwack. And I've thanked the Songhees and the Esquimalt people for allowing me to live, learn, and love in their traditional territory. And thanked you all for being here today. And so it's a little bit overwhelming for Leslie and I. We're like, well, if we just don't get that many people, we'll just have a conversation about this model that we've been thinking about for a couple of years. And then it's like, oh, there's 30 people on the wait list. So yeah, so thank you for coming and sharing with us. And we hope you enjoy the day.
Yes, I want to welcome everyone and echo Robina's words to acknowledge the territory that we're on. I'm very lucky. I've lived on this Lekwungen territory for 35 years. I have had settler ancestry, and I've had the privilege of living, working, playing with Indigenous peoples and communities my whole life, so I feel very honored. We're really glad to have you here. As Robina said, this started with her and I and Charlotte Loppy Redding. Where is Charlotte? She's not here yet. Sitting around and talking about the number of questions we get from people, because we all do a lot of engaged Indigenous community research, teaching, whatever. We get a lot of questions, and we said, well, maybe we should just hold a session, see if anybody would come. And if nothing else happens, the three of us get along really well, we'll have a good conversation, so we'll carve out the time. And obviously it's something that everybody, there's a lot of interest in, so we're very, very pleased that you're all here and very grateful. Thank you so much for coming. We wanted to share with you today a few things, but one of the big things about this work is relationships, right? It's all about relationships, this work in Indigenous communities, so we do want to take a moment to find out who you are in the room so that you can get to know each other, because we've been working together for a long time. We may have some experience and knowledge, but everybody in here, I know some of the people in here have way more experience, knowledge, and expertise than I do. So it's going to be a communal kind of workshop, and so that we can take advantage of all the knowledge that's in the room. So we thought if everybody could just introduce yourself, just your name quickly, and just to kind of ground us a little bit, give us the name of one of your favorite ancestors that you might want to bring with you today in this workshop.
What's important about us acknowledging an ancestor is it really speaks to our connections. And so when we're talking about Indigenous people, even though many of us are gone through colonization and all of those other processes, we still have ancestors and we still have those stories. And as Thomas King would remind us, stories are all that we are. Today our objectives are to introduce the Working with Indigenous Communities series, and so today's the first one, and we have two more, and we'll tell you about those at the end. To share a model or a framework that Leslie and I have been working on to build relationships in the room, and it was really wonderful to hear how many people are here to try understand more about working with Indigenous people, but also how many people are working with Indigenous communities or projects. And so hopefully something we say today will resonate with you differently than maybe how you've thought about it. And hopefully to get an opportunity to teach and to learn, so that it's not just Leslie and I up here, but that we both are a part of this, that we can bring back to our practice.
We've got up here working across difference, and that's kind of what Robina and I think about in working with Indigenous communities, that it really isn't about learning about Indigenous cultures or traditions or learning about the other, whatever the other might be. It's about learning how to work across difference, whatever that difference is. And so with that kind of a spirit is what we bring to the workshop today. And we picked the artwork to display that that was done by Dylan Thomas, who is a student here at UVic, a well-known artist, and also happens to be Robina's baby. Not baby, middle child.
My middle child, yeah.
And she's very, very proud.
And we used some of Dylan's art when we were in England, but Dylan Thomas has a completely different sense in England. Yeah. And I kept saying, no, not that one. Yeah. This is my Dylan Thomas. So, some of the work that we've been doing over the years is around, started off, Leslie and I being social workers and all, around social work and social work practice. And particularly anti-oppressive practice, when that was kind of what we were talking about. And when we started thinking about engaging with dignity, one of the core things is that we think that it's necessarily complicated and uncomfortable. And that when we're working with Indigenous communities and families, we need to understand that we're going into those communities in a good way, with a good mind and a good heart. And so because you're entering people's lives, it should be complicated and uncomfortable. We should always be reflecting on, did I do everything the right way? Is there something I could have done different? And so we really wanted to emphasize that. We wanted to also emphasize that it forces us to critically self-reflect. Like I said, always, always reflecting on what we've done and never take it for granted. And I know, I think about teaching myself, I think about teaching and how intentional I try to be when I teach. I still get really nervous. And my colleague said to me, Robina, the day you stop, Gail Sear, our colleague, our friend, said, when you stop getting nervous, quit, because then you've lost the passion. And so I do get really nervous. And I get nervous thinking about everyone who was going to be here today and looking at the list. Oh, who's coming? You know, like you do in an institution like this, right? Oh, Katie, my boss is here. One of the things I do know is that it's all about relationships. And you know, as the university moves forward now around community university engagement, and I just giggle and I say, isn't it funny that in 2014 and 15, as academics, as members of communities, we realize it's about relationships. You know, isn't that just something that we've taken so long to just say, some of this is really basic, and it's about being really, really good human beings, and it's about how we are with each other. But at its core, it includes an analysis of power and strives to work across difference. So we're not trying to make someone the same as us. We're not trying to ask someone to understand how it is to be me. But we need to figure out how to work across that difference. We're the ones that are going in as the research, as the knowledge holders. Whether or not we think that we have a lot of power, we carry that power with us. And so, certainly when we say we're from the university, or we're doing a project for the university, or we're somehow engaged, that brings a whole lot of power with it. And there's no use pretending we don't. It does. But it's making sure that we never abuse that power. And so we want to share a couple of things that that happened to us.
Yeah, just to give you an example of this kind of inaction, and where with the years of experience that we both had, how we can really screw up sometimes, right? So we worked on a project called Someone's Mother, Sister, and Daughter, and that was a project that we did with the other investigators were Janine Carrier and Susan Strigg and the School of Social Work. And we interviewed 99 street sex workers in Western Canada. And the interview process, and we did it in collaboration with sex work organizations, and we did it all in the right way. And the majority, like 95% of the women we spoke to, were Indigenous women. And we wanted to give back, and so we started to, as we started to gather data and start to begin to make sense of it, we went back to each community that we were in, and we presented back to have discussions. And we talked about, you know, how are we going to do that? How are we going to go back to each community, go to Winnipeg and Regina and Edmonton and all the places we were going to, and how are we going to do this in a good way? And we all know the protocols, but we had limited budget. How are we all going to get there? We were all stressed, as you all know, to the max, and way too much to do. And when we went to one community, it went really well. We had 2 days, everybody was happy. There were a lot of people showed up, and it was really engaged, and we all walked away from that, and we were sitting around and just kind of debriefing it a bit, the self-reflective part, and we realized that all of us had the same kind of feeling in the pit of our stomach that we couldn't quite articulate, that something was wrong. It didn't feel right, even though we didn't get any feedback from everybody that it was wrong, but then we started to, when we started to fess up, I don't know if I feel that good about it, after we were patting each other on the back of how well it went. Well, I don't know if you, then, well, I don't feel good, I don't feel good. Yeah. So what was it? We didn't take gifts. The budget didn't have a line item for gifts. And we know, you always take gifts. And we thought, well, we're giving food, and we'll take some blankets for the elders, and that, but not everybody went away with a gift. That didn't feel right. We realized we were not focusing as much on the participants as we were on our research project and the processes, as opposed to just being with the people in the room. So after we talked a lot about this, we really had to call each other on a bunch of stuff, and it was a hard, wonderful, fabulous discussion that we had, and we learned an awful lot. that we were able to put into action for the next community we went to. And we ended up going back to that first community and doing something again that we could do in a good way. We redid it, and we took blankets, and we took gifts, and we found the money from our own pockets to be able to do what we knew we had to do. So it's that even though we were a well-experienced team, we were half Indigenous, half non-Indigenous, but we still had problems, and we needed to face up to them and call each other on some things. And we just wanted to give that example of how these working across difference, engaging with dignity is complicated, messy, uncomfortable, always.
And often goes wrong.
And often goes wrong.
And it's about what we do when it goes wrong that's really, really important, that we don't just kind of pretend it didn't go wrong, but that we actually go back and make it right.
Yes. So, we wanted to think about, there's a lot of experience in this room. When we looked at the people who were coming, we thought, oh wow, we got everybody here who knows all kinds of things that we don't know. So we wanted you to think about this idea of working across difference, and think about examples from your context. Think about engaging with dignity with Indigenous communities that you've worked with. And think about what gifts do you have in your repertoire. You know, we each had our own gifts that we were bringing to that process, but what gifts would come in handy that brings you here today, right? Things that you kind of don't know, that would be gifts that you might need as you continue on your work, because maybe in the end we've got some exchange of gifts that can happen here. So we thought because it's a workshop, take a few minutes, find a partner, 2 or 3, 4 in a group, get your chairs around, and talk about the gifts that you have and that you bring to your work with Indigenous communities, and the gifts that would come in handy, whether that's knowledge, experience, money, access, whatever the gifts are that you think you need or want. Okay? It's a workshop, so we're putting you to work. Come on, pick up your chairs, move around. We're not going to spend a lot of time. It's a quick and dirty conversation.
We'll try to think from a different perspective, and really it's like, no, go to the person who has the knowledge, who has the local and traditional knowledge, ask them, and I'm sure they'd be happy to share.
I think too, they talked a lot about like just being okay to work across the differences, so recognizing that there are differences and just being okay with that and being open to hearing. I think it's a gift of almost like kind of suspending your own beliefs or judgments until, you know what I mean? Like to be able to hear a different perspective and
don't try to guess what they're going to need, because
we know we have some power. So the question is how you use that for the best. So I've been working on my geography class really hard and trying to bring a gift of better knowledge and a little bit better understanding. But I do have some Indigenous students in my class, but obviously not that many. And it's always nice when they come and talk to me about it. But maybe the gift is trying indirectly to create a better understanding.
And we're on the frozen lake trying to use this ice auger to drill holes in ice. You want to either sample or go fishing. Didn't remember about the fishing aspect, so I'm up there trying to teach these students how to do it, struggling hard, and then finally one student's like, I think you're kind of doing that wrong. And obviously he'd been doing it since he was 4 with his grandpa, going out to ice fish, and just came up and schooled me right away, and I was like, so that was funny.
That's awesome. Yeah. It's starting to feel like most academic.
Yes.
And
so yeah, the co-learning.
I have the gift of an Indigenous student in my class. They have a much more nuanced understanding, obviously, of issues, and that to me is a real gift that I can use
So let's move on to what Robina and I have been talking about. We've been working for a long time about how we work in community and the ethics of that. And as we started to think about it, we kind of started to develop a model for what we've been doing. And Dylan's artwork, The Sacred Cycle, represent the model that Robina and I have, we're working on. Want to explain the sacred cycle
So
first?
the Sacred Cycle was Dylan's first print that he ever did. But what's important about the print is that he dedicated it, he calls it a Sacred Cycle, and he dedicated it to all of the artist ancestors that have gone on to the other side. And a recognition that everything we do and everything we know starts somewhere. And so for him, it was his love of Salish art was rooted somewhere. He didn't just one day wake up and love it. He knew that it was rooted somewhere. And so it was a dedication to his ancestors, to all of the artist ancestors. It was his commitment, so that's the past. It was his commitment to all of his mentors that were with him today, that were guiding and directing him and that were teaching him, and that for us, as Coast Salish, keeping the art of Coast Salish art alive, because there was not long ago where Coast Salish art was becoming very, very much influenced by other art forms, especially in the north part of BC. So it was a commitment to going back and doing real traditional Coast Salish art forms. And it was his commitment to bringing this forward to those yet to come. And that he saw this as a sacred cycle, keeping the past, the present, and the future connected. And so one of the things that Leslie and I kept thinking about is that's so much of what keeps us thinking and keeps us moving is that connection to the past, the present, and the future.
Yeah, it's become an ethical way of working. It's how do you keep the past and the future present right here, which is why we started by asking you to bring in an ancestor. Is that in everything that we do, if we're trying to keep the past with us and the future with us, it changes how we interact. So I haven't met you before, but now that I think we are going to be in relationship with one another for the rest of our lives, lucky you, it's going to change how we interact with each other right now in this moment, right? And if we've got some sharing about our ancestors and our history together and how we come to be in this place, it changes how we interact in these moments. So as Robina and I start to talk about what our ethic is when we work in Indigenous communities, we start to realize that Dylan's graphic really reflected, his artwork reflected how we try to practice, is always thinking about the history and the future and how that impacts our behavior and what we think and what we do in the moment every day. So that, in a nutshell, is our model. Now the past, so how do you actually apply that, right? Okay, it sounds really good, how you actually apply it. So the past, how to understand, historical relationships. So when we're working with a community, for instance, we went to New York once, and we were making a presentation at a conference. It wasn't an Indigenous conference, so we didn't know, but we're on somebody's territory. How do we find out whose territory, where the conference is? Well, we can use Wikipedia. Okay, that gets you so far, but that's not really the right way to do this. How are we going to do that? So then we start working the networks of people we know, and who knows somebody, and where are they from, and how do we, and you were on the phone, and until eventually we found something that seemed like it was an honorable and authentic way for us to be able to engage with whose territory we were going to be on, learning a little bit about some of the history of that territory, to at least give a sense that we had some connection with the people of that place. So history is really important. Settler Indigenous relationships in any community are unique. There's the colonization informs all that we do. When working in Canada between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and between Indigenous peoples themselves and between non-Indigenous peoples themselves, right? We're all part of this colonization thing, right? So how do we understand that history and how it's impacting our relationships in any given moment? Learning about history, residential schools, learning about all kinds of things, and taking the time to talk about history. It isn't something to get over. Yeah, that was horrible, and let's get over it and move on. No, it's something to bring to our moment. It doesn't mean you dwell on the past, but you bring the past into the moment. And so there's lots of different ways that we try to do that with each other or with the people we're working with.
In my teaching, one of the things that I try, well, I shouldn't say I try, one of the things I do all the time is when I start my class, I say, we're not going to talk about Indigenous issues. We're going to talk about colonial policies and practices in Canada. And then you come at it from a completely different way. And so the focus isn't always on the poor Indigenous people and all their communities and their broken cars and their reservations and all of those stereotypical things that may come to someone's mind. When we start to talk about health, and I'll say, what colonial policies and practices is that linked to? And what we do then is we start to look at colonization. Yelmer's carving a pole,
Yeah.
so he's busy, and he's doing a good job, yeah. But it's always about that connection to Canada and to how we are implicated as Canadians in this process of colonization. And so, but it really shifts it away, and I actually see students want to be more engaged when they start to think about it that way, because they're kind of like, well, I don't understand some of that. But when you start to talk about Canadian policies and practices, they have something to then start to want to dig into and say, holy shit, I never thought about it that way. I've never thought about the fact that the Indian Act is a Canadian piece of legislation, that it is not something that we have in our reserve that's posted as you know, entering the reserve and here's the Indian Act. It's much bigger than that, that it is actually a piece of Canadian legislation. So it does help. And so I think, you know, reminding people that this is our history.
The future, and then so how do you engage in the future? How do you dream together? How do you imagine different futures together, individually and collectively? So for instance, in the Someone's project, where we were working with sex work organizations and sex workers, we were able to talk about our own personal histories, futures, and present, and come as whole people, right? We're whole people. We're not just researchers. We've got whole people. I got kids and grandkids and all kinds of things, and I come with a whole set of relationships and imagined futures that now I'm going to bring, again, we're in a relationship now, you're bringing your imagined futures together, and what are we going to imagine together? So spending time thinking about not goals, of what we're going to achieve, that's a different kind of process, but imagining the possibilities together and trying to bring that into the work that we do, that's part of ethical engagement.
The women themselves that we worked with, the people, I can't see women, the people that we worked with, the sex workers, said to us, we want you to tell a different story. So they had a vision. And so when we went back to the communities, and they said, we know the day-to-day reality. We're not thinking that we don't want you to paint a story that there's no violence and all of this, but they said, we also want you to talk about our role as mothers. We want you to talk about our role around leadership. And so we did. We have a chapter in a book on mothering. You know, survival sex workers and mothering on the street. But they wanted us, they said, we want you to tell some different stories. And so as a part of being future thinking, we told different stories, and we shared those stories with them. We said, these are the stories we're thinking of telling, and they loved it, and they thanked us for trying to look at it differently.
Yes, they also called us on a few things too.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
When you broached that group to work with them, was it a wide open invitation to work collaboratively, or did you say these are some things that we have in our imagined futures? What would you see as the direction we could go together? How did we enter? We started with relationships with the agencies to have sessions where they would introduce us to the sex workers, and we started by being, hi, I'm Leslie, these are my kids, this is my connection to the topic. I've got family members who are street sex workers. This is my worry, this is my, this is why I'm doing this is my connection, and who are you? And we built it from there, right? So it was really built from the ground up, relationship by relationship. Yes?
Leslie, if you didn't have a family member who was also a sex worker, how would it have been different for you? Because it seems to me that there's an immediate trust there, just because of that shared experience.
Certainly in the group that we had, we all had personal connections to the issue. But I would say in most research that I've done, I've got to find a personal connection to it somehow, or else I've got to rethink why I'm doing it. Like, this work has got to be personal. Too long as researchers or professionals, we were told to separate the professional or the researcher from oneself, and that's not part of working in an ethical way as far as we're concerned in our model. It's very personal. So finding that personal connection and being able to share that is key. I did some work 25 years ago in a community up island, and part of it was we are now in relationship for the rest of my life. They still come knock on the door every now and again, say, have you got a place to stay? I'm in town. Oh, right, you were this tall when I saw you. Come on in. You know, but you figure out what the personal connection is and what you're willing to give, and just be authentic. You don't have to be all open, but you be authentic and be genuine, and that'll get you a long way. Okay, so that's in a nutshell our model. So we wanted to give you another example, which is one that the institute. Oh, did I miss the present? Okay,
Yeah.
Future, past.
Yeah. So you know, the past and the present, or the past and the future brings us to the present and how we are today and how we want to honor history and know that our actions of today make for different futures. And so basically, what we do and how we do it really matters, because we can make a difference in many of the places we go. But one of the things that we really think that's important, and Leslie was talking about this at the beginning, is we need to stop at some point and ask ourselves, how do I know what I know? And I don't think we often spend a lot of time doing that. And I think that we all think we're, good academics or good teachers or good whatever it is that we do, because that's why we do it. Not many of us think we're really shitty and carry on trying to do it, I don't think. But a really good example around socialization that I give all the time is my son Dylan, so the artist, is in grade 2 here in Victoria at school. And he comes home one day and he's really upset and he's crying, and I'm like, wow, son, what's wrong? And he's really upset, and he said, those little girls told me they didn't have to play with me because I was nothing but a dirty Indian. But now, that's sad, and he's okay. He survived, and he'll be okay. But think that those girls were in grade 2, so how old were they, 7? 6, 7? I doubt if any of their parents or their grannies or their grandpas said, sit here, we're going to talk about Indians. And we're going to tell you that they're dirty, that you don't have to play with them, and in fact you have enough power that you can tell them that. I'm sure no one, those little girls, I'm sure no one did that to those little girls. But by 7, in this beautiful little city that we live in, those girls, 3 of them in a class, had internalized enough to be able to say to Dylan, I don't need to play with you, you're an Indian. And that's the power of socialization that I think we sometimes ignore in our hurriedness to be good researchers and to be good, whatever it is that we think we're doing. Have we actually looked inside and started to unlearn some of the things that we were socialized by the time we were 7? What are those other things that we've internalized by the time we're 7 that influence how we gaze at the world today? Whether it's Indigenous people, whether it's all of the differences, all of the many differences that we have to work across. And so in the present, that's one of the things that really, really matter to us, is that in order to work with Indigenous communities, really, really requires a personal commitment to wanting to be the best human being you can, and to be truly, truly committed to working across difference and doing that critical self-reflection. Because it's those relationships and it's those moments when you feel that thing in your stomach where you think, oh my God, I feel like I'm gonna throw up, that maybe you need to stop and say, what is that thing? And where did that come from? And how can I get there and unravel that and see whether I am actually seeing the world through maybe my racist great-great-grandfather from many, many years ago, with those things that I grew up hearing, or my granny, my grandma, whatever it is, but those things that we need to unbecome. And it's not always just around racism, it's around all kinds of things. You know, I was so ashamed. I had 3 cousins that died on the streets here in Victoria, and I was very, very ashamed of them for many, many years, and I used to always be, they can go home. Like, why don't they go home? We have family. We have communities, we have supports, and I used to always think this about my cousins. And then I did my research on Cooper Island Residential School, and quickly realized that one of their brothers was hung at Cooper Island Residential School. And I say hung because the family is quite sure that he didn't commit suicide, but it's called a suicide. The whole family went to residential school. The family was systematically broken down and segregated and taken from their community. And now 3 of them are on the streets. And I really was ashamed of them. And I do this research, and I'm so ashamed of myself that I didn't know that history, that I hadn't learned that I hadn't ever problematized why they were on the streets, why they were drinking Chinese, cooking wine, and why they never ever found their way home. And in fact, I realized after my research that that was their home. They found a place to belong. And so it's not just, you know, it happens to us too. We judge and we make really erroneous assumptions about why things are happening. And I'll never forget the day I went down to my cousins and gave them money to go do what they wanted to do with it, because I used to walk by them quite embarrassed, and I went and I said, go buy lunch, go buy coffee, go buy cooking wine, you know, like, you go. And just told them that, you know, I didn't tell them I was sorry, but I just told them that I loved them and that I cared about them. But that took me years to do that. So socialization, right? And so we all have our work that we need to do.
One of the things that Robina does in her class, and we've done to each other, and I would challenge us to continue to do it with each other in a supportive way, is to show each other where you're not seeing things, right? One of the things you do is you ask students in your class, I know how many people know who the mayor of Victoria is. People say, oh yes, this. How many people know who the chief of the Songhees is? How is it that you can live here? Because I bet you if you went on the reserve, on the Songhees Reserve, they all know who the mayor of Victoria is. How does it come that you could not know who the chief is, who's been the chief Ron Sam for a while, or Chief Andy Thomas in Esquimalt, that are how we're socialized, how that knowledge gets passed around, that some knowledge is expected that people have, and some knowledge is not expected that people have. It's just like you're doing the extra thing if you know that, as opposed to being expected. So how do we support one another in calling each other on these things and pointing them out to one another? That's part of the ongoing work, and that project that we did with our colleagues was very supportive and very challenging because of that, because we made a commitment to one another to call each other on what we were seeing and not seeing. And we all had a piece in it. All right, now I can go on. Yeah. I'm the one that's always going too fast. UVic has recently entered into a collaboration agreement with the Wasanic School Board. How many people know about this? Oh, excellent. A couple of people know. We brought copies for everybody because it's a really good example of this idea of putting the past and the present and the future together, but done on an institution-wide basis. Oh yeah, well, make sure everybody gets one. And this agreement has been in the making for
a number of years.
Long.
Yeah.
It's built on relationships.
But what you'll really find different, I think, about this agreement than probably a lot of other agreements that you've seen is it's based on principles. It's how we're going to work together, not what we're doing together. It's rooted in traditional Sinchothan teaching. So we have some linguists in the room. They might want to tell us how to pronounce these words. I'm Ho'okaminam. I can translate them into Ho'okaminam, but I can't say them in Sinchothan really well. So the very first one, bring in your good feelings. For the Ho'okaminam, we have a term, ait shkwalowin. Well, shkwalowin is mind and heart, but ait is good. So good mind and heart. So you'll notice if you walked into the first people's house at either end, if you stop for a second and read that sign, it asks us to leave our bad feelings behind. In our traditional longhouses, the elders tell us, and some houses actually have a hook, but most of them don't. But the elders tell us when we step foot into the big house, that there's a hook outside, and leave all your negative and bad feelings out there. You come into the big house with an open mind, an open heart, a good mind and a good heart. And you come in open for seeing across difference, for working across difference, for understanding things differently. And then in my community, the elders say, if you want to pick it up when you go ahead. And if not, leave it there and it'll be taken away. But this first one is about Aitkwalo and working with a good mind and a good heart, going in a good way. And then you can see how they talk about what those guiding principles are and what they mean.
We wanted to give this an example because, as Robina said, it's an agreement that looks different than other agreements because it's about how we're going to be together, not what we're going to do together. And the focus of our model of protocols of dignity is about that relational piece. It's about our relation. It's not about you and I. Lord knows what we're going to do together. We might go drinking together. We might do a research project together. Who knows what we're going to do? But it's about how we're going to be together. And that then forms the basis for ethical engagement. Any questions on that? Yes, Bruce.
Coming from a settler ally position, that feels really uncomfortable because it's saying for all the historical and current trauma, you can't be angry. To come in to just leave leave anger that there's not room for anger there. So I can see like all the value for that, but it would feel like an uncomfortable request to me.
I don't think it says you have to leave your passion and commitment. I think you could be still really passionate and committed about the things you believe in, but it is asking you to leave the negative. And so for me, that's a fine line, right? I'm really, really passionate, and sometimes I shut students down, and I tell them that at the beginning of the course. But I don't think I'm angry. You know, and I don't think I've got some students in here that I've taught over the years, and they might be able to say, I don't think, you know, that I get really, really angry. But I think there's a line where you cross, but I don't think they're asking you to leave your passion or your commitment or your dedication. So I think it's about flipping it around. I don't know, does that? Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, so what we want you to do now is apply this model that you've got the protocols of dignity, making the past and the future come and live in the moment. And you've got the example of the one that UVic has done with the Wasanic School Board. And think about applying that to who you are and the work that you are either have done, are doing, or want to do. All right, so again, we're going to put you in small groups again. What do you know about the history of the community you might be working with, and how do you know it? So just starting to think about what do you know and how do you know it? That's a question to always ask. What do you know and how do you know it? What do you know about the shared visions of the future? What's your vision if you're working with a community? And how will you find out about others? So starting to think about, are you having any conversations or thoughts about the future? How might you bring the past and the future to your present understanding and action? And how might you create the space between? So that's the bringing the past and the future together. How are you going to do that? What does that actually mean for you and who you are? And then having witnessed the collaboration agreement, how might you take some of these teaching into your own work? Now we realize it's a lot of questions, but we want you to start the conversation, right? This is about working with others in relationship to start to think about your own self, the gifts you have, the gifts you need, and putting it all together with the past and the future into the present and how you are right in this moment today with the people around you. Yes, we can make the PowerPoint accessible. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So is that clear what you're supposed to do in your small groups? It really is working with each other, and there's, you know, it's working in relationship. Working in relationship. So small groups, we'll take a few minutes and do that. So about 15 minutes or so. Great. Okay. We wanted to come back collectively to the large group. I hope you've been able to start to have some good conversations in your small groups about what this might mean, or lessons things you're going to take away. But we thought as your small groups maybe had identified some things that are takeaways from today that we might want to share some of them with a larger group. So does anybody want to talk about or mention something from their small group that would be helpful in teaching us all about insights or how these things apply? Because getting examples from other people helps us all in figuring out how to apply these models. Yes, Mark.
Well, I'll just share the one that I talked a little bit about is, I was thinking about a committee that I'm working on now, and that we haven't done a lot of that kind of what's your story and kind of how did you get there. So kind of we haven't spent a lot of time getting to know about each other, but the little, so we've done little bits of that, and I just realized though with one of the individuals from that group, the little bit I know, I've now put him in a box. That, okay, I know who you are and what you're about, and in fact it's a box that, you know, it's not the good box to be in. And so, you know, it's like, I gotta take him out of that box and stop treating him as if he belongs in that box.
There's gotta be more in that box. That's a great example.
Thank you.
Maybe in our corner, maybe I'll ask Eric to add to this. Eric has had to do a lot of outreach in his job, and said stuff in the books is ridiculous, and also people rightly ask you in the community, especially Indigenous community, like, why do you want to know this stuff? Why do you want to have a relationship? And another thing you said is what you should know and what are you allowed to know. And also it takes many years, I think 30, 35 years of working in communities. There was a common vision about what they wanted to get done. They both had a passion for language revitalization, so that was a common vision. So if it's not a project that people are buying into from a community that was organized. So we talked about that, and then in places like Alberta and stuff where there is, you know, one of the group members was saying it's completely what we call the racist discourse, completely in the family. So it's just, where do you start? So you start by telling stories about, well, somebody's mother worked in the residential school, they did the best they could, and all this kind of stuff. And so it's being authentic about where we're coming from, knowing our past, but also that doesn't also let you off the hook. Being a settler means you still have a commitment to community and to take care of the land, whether you're living in, you know, Saanich or Oak Bay or whatever. And so that was another thing that Eric, you want to mention that, Eric? Somebody was saying to you. Listen.
Oh yeah, just someone mentioned to me once about, he said his grandmother told him that he felt a big problem was people here don't feel connected to this place, and they always talk about them. They're from Europe or they're from somewhere else, and you know it's okay to be from here sometimes. Like this is your home, and you should take care of it and respect it like we do. Like this is our home as well. So I just thought that was important. It's kind of just another layer that we are from elsewhere, but we also are from here. We need to respect this place. So.
Nate, you also raised a really good point that I didn't say today, that I usually do, is a lot of times when people want to learn about Indigenous ways of knowing and being or working in Indigenous communities, they think somehow they're going to learn about culture. And really what we talk about is working across difference. That it's not about the culture. There's so much. I'm Coast Salish, Tasha's Coast Salish. I don't know whether there's other people in the room that are Coast Salish, but the majority of our culture and tradition takes place in a Thiet Leyland or a big house that you don't talk about. And so when you go into our communities, if you think you're going to learn something about our culture and tradition, you're not going to learn a lot. You will learn teachings, like the teachings that are in this document. But as far as like the ceremonies, there's so many of them that are so sacred. So it's also us about flipping, because we talk about even how we word some of the training we do. Cultural sensitivity training, it's not about culture. You know, it's not like if we learn to make a drum, we're going to be better people, or sing a song, that we're going to all of a sudden treat Indigenous people different. It's about us actually digging deep and learning to work across difference. And so even how we word some of the work we do around culture and tradition.
And the materialism behind taking, wanting to have something, wanting to have a culture, wanting to, that energy being so strong.
Sorry, someone over here, I interrupted. Yes.
Oh, I was just going to say that I've taught up at UVic in environmental studies for 16 years now. And one of the themes that I've developed in the classes that I teach, because most of the students that I'm teaching are from elsewhere. They're Caucasian or Asian background. Occasionally I have First Nation students, but not that often. And I find that as an academic and as an instructor and as someone who grew up in 2 First Nations communities where people from the outside were always dropping in, asking rude, noisy questions, and then leaving and never coming back again, there's that uncomfortable position of speaking about the other, I think you mentioned earlier. And I have a very strong colonial history. My great-grandfather developed what's now North Vancouver, starting in the 1800s. I mean, that was a big chunk of land that was taken away from people. And so what I've developed with my students is a couple of themes in our classes, and one of them is, how do you live like you're staying? Because we're also transient now. Because we're coming to Victoria to go to school, or maybe we were lucky enough to be born here. But if we go back 1 or 2 generations, 99% of students in my class are others from outside. And because we have different cultural backgrounds that within 1 or 2 generations now with assimilation are being lost, who are we? And we're talking often about environmental issues, social issues, First Nations issues. And a lot of the things that have happened, obviously in a more dramatic and a pretty horrendous way to First Nations on the coast, have happened in different ways to people in my classes, but they've never thought about it that way. So I get them to think about agricultural history, because most of them are Caucasian. And how many of you know, well, how many of your great-grandparents had a garden? Most people put up, here, let's do it here. How many of your great-grandparents had a garden? How many of your great-grandparents knew how to save seeds? How many of your grandparents grew a garden? How many of them knew how to save seeds? How many of your parents grew a garden? How many knew how to save seeds? How many of you grow a garden? How many of you know how to save seeds? Well, you were a statistical anomaly. And I would also point out that there is an age gradient in this room. Most of my students are in their 20s, and about 90% of them do not know how to plant a seed or save a seed. And they're in environmental studies, so they're already self-selected for people. So the first question I ask is, how do you live like you're staying? Even if you're just somewhere for a conference for a weekend, what can you do to steward that landscape? And it's the conversation that I have with the students and the feedback I get from them is, wow, I've started, because I challenge them to do that for the term. And what they'll say is, I feel really happy. I feel grounded. I feel like I have a purpose. And yeah, I've just noticed all these spin-off benefits. And the second thing I get them to think about is stewardship. You know, how do you look after where you are, just even in small ways, and also to think about the culture that they're losing intergenerationally. Another question that's powerful to ask people is, you know, when did we stop taking our children to work with us? And what does it mean? Because it's not just that we're really distanced from our other family members for the majority of their waking hours, but it's that those values, things that are important to us in our own family and our own sense of who we are, those don't get passed on. And then it's the peer group that becomes important. And anyone who's watched television lately knows that that's not it.
I think that's a really good point. I really like that idea of thinking like you're staying.
Yeah. Back to what we're talking about here, there was a point in that. And that is that when I work with communities, whether they're ones that I grew up in or ones that I'm working on now with my PhD research, that's always the first thing that I think about is, how do I be here like I'm staying?
Yeah. Great. Another group. Thank you. Somebody else? Group or person, individual? Want to share? Come on, I was overhearing some really good points. Yes, Kelly.
This is what I raised and we talked a bit about, and that is the collaboration agreement sets out a number of fabulous principles and represents a relationship together, not just what we want to do, as you said. But I sort of wondered about this seems like there's a chicken and an egg kind of phenomenon in a way of building those agreed principles and ways of being together, and then in an institution, or you could say as a person, or whatever level you want to say as a project, having that ability to then meet and match where the rubber meets the road, how to implement, how to live those principles that are agreed. And so I sort of wondered about that piece of it, you know, and I'm curious to know more about the collaboration agreement, how it's played out at UVic as an institution. How is it being supported, and any number of ways as this goes forward and you're living it. So I think that applies also to our work. We can come to an understanding. It doesn't necessarily mean we have the capacity, using the word Robin, to actually live it, and curious about how we make that journey and match them up.
Well, it's interesting in just the number of years that it took to get there. There was a lot of doing and learning about how you're going to be together through the doing of things. So you're right in that it's not just all about the being first before we decide what we're going to do. I think these things kind of go. Time is a funny thing. It just keeps going around and around and around these things. So I don't know if you want to talk about where this is at right now.
Well, because it's a collaboration agreement, it's really about how we want to be together. And so under this, eventually will come all kinds of service agreements. And those are much more about what we're going to do.
Yeah.
But this about living, I think that Kendra Underwood, who is the, what is her title? Lots of people here work with SANEC. She's not the education coordinator, she's the
director of
SANEC
Education, SANEC Adult Education
Okay,
Center.
yeah. So Kendra, I know one of the things that's happened is Kendra has no problem now calling myself, anyone in the Office of Indigenous Affairs, all kinds of things, phoning and saying, hey, this is going on out here and we're not really happy about it. So one of the things that happened that's a really good example is there was someone out there that was asked from a class, I don't know what class, but they were asked to go collect something in a community. Or they were asked to go collect something. So they ended up in one of the 4 Wet'suwet'en communities. And someone went up to them and said, what are you doing? And they said, oh, well, as part of a class, we were asked to go da-da-da. And they said, oh, okay. Kendra got a hold of us and said, when you have students coming into our communities, are you talking about how they come into our communities? Are you telling them that could they please come and come to someone and let us know that they're going to be in the community and who they are and what class they're in or whatever, just so that if anything happened, we would know. So Kendra, like that, someone said something to Kendra, Kendra called us. So we're starting, and it's going to take time. And do they trust us? Probably not. And I was saying, we were talking about, the teaching, how do you say it? Being of a good mind. The first one. I can't say that. I can't say this in Chopin. Squelequins? Yeah. We say Hqualowin. But when I was doing my PhD research, I interviewed Ho'okame'lim women, and I was talking about women in leadership. Well, we never talked about leadership, which is telling in and of itself. But what the women told me is it's about living a good life. And they talked about teachings that are about living a good life. And they said leaders live their values and beliefs, is basically what they said. And one of them was Hqualowin. So we were talking about Hqualowin and nuts and mount were all one. And I said, well, that sounds kind of simple. And I had 5 elders that I interviewed, and they basically said to me, try be of a good mind and a good heart for 24 hours, and then come back and talk to me about how easy life is. So yeah, just a little challenge for you all if you just want to try it. It's really hard.
And what I'd say on the other side, as Kendra can call Robina or whoever, on the UVic side, there was just a small number of us that were out there for the signing ceremony, but we're now taking it wherever we can.
Yeah.
So that UVic is aware, and people who work and live here and play here realize that we've got a commitment. And because it's kind of buried somewhere in some department, in some relationship. So how do we get it out as if we've got a relationship? So that's kind of on our side, and we hope that you all will now as well. And if you want a copy of it in PDF, just send us an email at the q@uvic.ca, and we'll send you a PDF version of it. Because we want to get it out there so that the UVic side can live up to our commitment about how we want to be in relationship. That's that side. Anybody else?
I'll stand on top of you. One of the things that struck me about this was the emphasis on being. And so both with my ethics hat, but also with my academic hat, I think it was really insightful because when I'm reading, whether it's a research application or an ethics application, the emphasis is all on do. How are you doing this? What are you doing? Whether it's in ethics, what will you do to recruit? What will you do to do this? And then if it's a research proposal, well, what is your methodology and all of the rest of it? And for me, I'd like to thank you because it was this huge eye-opener where I was like, oh, it doesn't necessarily have to be about the doing. There's also the perspective the being. So I think that we can actually take this into our day-to-day relationships with students in terms of how we approach the Indigenous scholarship that's going on from a perspective other than, you know, for me, what my training was. So
that's fabulous. Thank you. One of the things we wanted to end with is that we've both been taught and we learned the hard way about gifting people, and gifts have kind of been a theme. So we've got, again, we got no money, but we got, so we've got gifts for everybody. And some of you were probably at the QVIC conference last summer, and we had little sandwich bags made out of recycled flags from the city of Victoria. And inside it, we put an institute sponsors this event, a brochure, nothing like the promo, and a pen. So this is our gift to each and every one of you for coming today, and thank you so much for attending.